I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and elders both past, present and emerging, and in particular the Pamalong clan of the Awabawal people on whose land the campus resides and where we in the room are located today. And thank you very much for the opportunity and invite to speak to you. So what we will do today, and the slides will catch up with me eventually. What we will be doing today is a couple of different things. We will start off by talking a bit about the status of German as a language and language community in Newcastle. We'll then look at the various waves of German-speaking migrants whose migration has shaped this community and put that in the context of language policies and mainstream ideology about language. We'll then talk about our research project and the question we're seeking to answer and consider the factors affecting language transmission in a thematic analysis.
So let's have a quick look at those people who have German ancestry and may potentially use German in the area. So I just got some quick stats here from the 2016 census. Okay, fair enough, it's a couple of years older than the most recent one, but still. What we can see here is that German is the seventh most common ancestry across the country, but it is the most common non-Anglo-Celtic ancestry in Newcastle and the Hunter region. So the German language is the 13th most commonly spoken language, but we can see here the numbers. There's only still 2.2 per 1,000 people claiming to speak German in the census, which is below the national average. But what we have to consider here is in the census, what they ask about language is the language used in the home. So that means, as people are nodding, so we're very much aware that if you use language outside of the home, so I live by myself, I speak to myself in German, yes, but I speak more German outside of my home than I do in my home. That doesn't mean I don't know any German. So it's a bit of a poor census question. So let's move on.
Okay, so German migration to the region goes back to the mid-19th century. But migrants who came before the First World War have left relatively little ongoing linguistic remnants. There are certainly people who trace their German ancestry back to the mid-19th century and are proud of it in the region, but they don't speak German. German-speaking heritage in the region, contemporary German speakers originate rather in three waves of migration that are all 20th century. And these waves were marked by different characteristics influencing language learning. The first wave were German-speaking Jewish migrants, the so-called 38ers or 39ers from the 2 years in which most of them came, who came from Germany and Austria to escape National Socialism. And they were predominantly middle class, and they tended to be economically and educationally advantaged. They mostly settled in proximity to the existing synagogue, the Newcastle Synagogue on the hill. And they pretty quickly became connected to the local Jewish community, which was a predominantly English-speaking Jewish community. English as their day-to-day language, Hebrew as the language of worship, but not in any particular way a German-speaking community. Pre-migration experiences could also be a strong driver against first identifying with broader German culture or local German speakers who are not Jewish, and also against intergenerational language transmission. That is, the first generation often spoke German, but in many cases that was not passed on to the second generation. So, for example, Margaret's father came to Newcastle from Austria as a refugee in 1939 and was very proud of his cultivated upbringing in Vienna, his descent from a prominent Austrian Jewish family, but he asserted a specifically Viennese origin to distance himself from both being Austrian and from German culture more broadly. He didn't speak German, he spoke Viennese. A desire not to stand out either as German or as Jewish, also acted as a disincentive to expressions of Germanness in public. So, for example, Dennis's father escaped Germany for England as an unaccompanied minor in 1939 and later migrated to Australia in 1955 and was very determined to fit into the local community and to be to be part of the Anglophone community. And I should note that this was elsewhere in Australia, not in Newcastle. It wasn't. It was not Dennis's father who migrated to Newcastle, but it's Dennis himself who has become connected to the area. However, we should note that while Dennis's father didn't speak German at home, did not wish to engage in a German-speaking community, he didn't discourage Dennis from learning German. Okay, so we have a kind of ambivalence there. And such ambivalence was not always universal. So Ferbert's parents, and I should note that we're often using pseudonyms, and Ferbert absolutely chose her own. Ferbert's parents migrated from Germany in 1939, and her father had actually been imprisoned in a concentration camp for a month or so after Kristallnacht, but was philosophical about it. Took the view that if some other group had been the targets of National Socialism, then Jewish Germans may well have ended up amongst the perpetrators. Her family spoke German at home, at least initially, and had a large German-speaking social circle in Australia. But it is also interesting to note that their social circle of German speakers were all Jewish German speakers. There were no non-Jewish German speakers amongst them. Okay, that's the first wave. The second wave were the post-Second World War non-Jewish German migrants who came in large numbers, and they constituted the largest wave of German-speaking migrants to Australia in general and to Newcastle in particular, with somewhere between 30 and 40,000 migrants coming to Newcastle. And one of the challenges of identifying, who belongs to this wave is that they came from many different places. So they included West Germans and Austrians who were displaced by the destruction of the Second World War, the ruin of Germany, the occupation, and the post-war economic downturn. And Toby makes a great example of this. His father died during the war. His hometown was flattened. It became a border post on the West German-East German border. His stepfather couldn't find work, so when he was 13, they migrated to Newcastle. Interestingly, we also interviewed many Swiss German migrants and their descendants who wished to emphasise that despite Switzerland's neutrality, it was incredibly hard economically in Switzerland during and immediately after the Second World War as well, so they often came as economic migrants as well. Others fled the Soviet occupation of East Germany, such as Sarah's mother, who left for Austria as an unaccompanied minor before later migrating to Australia. Okay, so they as well. But the German migrants who came in that wave were disproportionately drawn from the so-called Germans abroad, the Auslandsdeutsche. Some 10 million ethnic Germans who came from minority communities in Eastern Europe, captured in this interwar map from places in Poland, in Romania, in Hungary, and so on. And at the end of the war, millions fled ahead of the Red Army to escape retribution from the Red Army, and millions more were forcibly expelled from East European countries after the war as collaborators with the Nazi regimes. And let's be clear about it, some of them collaborated with the Nazi regime, right? But that wasn't the grounds on which they were expelled. Okay, that was the justification, but the criteria on which people were expelled was being ethnic German in order to prevent any future territorial claims by Germany in the region. And so, for example, Djité's mother fled from Breslau, then in Silesia, now Wrocław in Poland, for example. When they arrived in West Germany, they arrived in a country ruined by war, in which they struggled to find homes and employment, as Gigi addresses, and consequently they disproportionately tended to migrate on and were overrepresented in the migrants who came to Australia. These economic migrants and displaced peoples of the second wave shared certain features in common. They often came to Australia as family units or couples, as a result of which German tended to be spoken at least amongst the first generation. They were predominantly working class with limited economic resources and were attracted to Newcastle by the heavy industry here. They settled in the new outer suburbs of Newcastle and as a consequence were geographically separated from the earlier middle-class Jewish settlement in towards the centre of the city. And these differences in class, education and experiences of the Second World War further reinforced the formation of, if you like, two separate communities. They tended to share a certain sense of nostalgia for their life before migration, but they also had a deep sense of ambivalence. But the second wave lacked the deep sense of ambivalence towards the German state due to the persecution of the Nazi period, because they had not experienced, as non-Jews, they had, of course, not experienced that. Although sometimes they had a sense of ambivalence associated with anti-German sentiment from the surrounding Anglophone population, hostility towards Germans. So I said there were two separate communities. We did find one place where they overlapped, and this was here, Fry's Delicatessen. This photo is from the 80s, but in the 50s and 60s, it was just about the only place in Newcastle where you could buy continental European food and sometimes kosher food as well. And so it remained one of the few places where where the two communities overlapped until by the late 1960s, the migrants had really started to shape the foodscape of Newcastle, and to quote Toby, Newcastle exploded with delicatessens, an image I delight in, I have to admit. The second wave was also distinctive because it founded its own social institutions, the most important of which was the Germania Club, founded in the 1950s, but establishing its own premises in Warners Bay in the 1970s. And this provided a context for communal life, cultural activities such as dancing, music, sports, card games. Interestingly, the second wave played skat, whereas the first wave played bridge. And also dining, and of course a place for speaking German. And indeed there was even a German Saturday school for children. We should note though that there was really no Jewish first wave membership of this German club. Okay, third and final wave forms with really from 1973 onwards, which is when Australia introduced skills requirements for migration to Australia. And we see an end of working class migration and instead a smaller scale, educated, middle class, skilled wave of migration. These were often lifestyle migrants coming to Australia for its better climate, or perhaps even to just escape the threat of nuclear war, as some in some cases. Many came as the spouses of Australian partners as well. And these people often spoke English before arriving, though not always. They were relatively atomised, they were geographically dispersed, there was no clear population centres as there had been for the second wave, they often intermarried, and they were not attracted to the Germania Club's working class culture, which they tended to describe as kitsch. They were no longer subjected to as much anti-German sentiment. By this point in time, the image of Germany as cool Germany had emerged, and they also benefited from declining travel costs and improved communications, making connections to Germany easier.
So we've got our three different migration waves there, but how does that fit in with policy, language policy, attitudes, and ideology? Well, the three key policies we have to keep in mind here, or three eras from this that affect our three different waves here, involve the rejecting era, or what Djité, at least anyway, somebody calls the rejecting era, which was up to the 1970s, with a huge change. That's why I hope to, there we go. What's going on? Why are we behind? What's going on? We're stuck.
Oh, I'm going to be able to fix it this time. I don't think
So we've
Keep
got
talking.
3 different waves, 3 different language policies around language ideology at the time. We've got the rejecting era, which was up into the 1970s. Then we have the multiculturalism era, which is around the 70s and 80s and 90s. And then we've got a third one, economic rationalism. So those 3 different things were happening. We've got these 3 different migration waves. And we can't work out what's going on. But more details about the rejecting era. The rejecting phase, which Michael Clyne, everyone probably knows about Michael Clyne. If not, you should. This was when there was a lot of hostility. So up into the 1970s, there's a lot of hostility towards people of different language backgrounds, different languages, and so on. So anyone who was non-Anglo-Celtic was marginalised socially. So even though there was a growing prominence in multilingual communities of many different migration languages coming to, or migrant languages coming to Australia into the 1960s, there was still this dominant, no, you come here, your entry to Australia is dependent on your use of knowledge of English. But there was a huge, or should I shut up?
Well, no, I just,
We want to open the meeting.
German on your, oh, that is just open it. I just clicked on that one.
Sorry about these people at home. Oh, that one. Okay. Are we in business?
Beautiful.
Yes. All right. Are we going to have the same problem as before with this? There we go. All right, the rejecting era I've just spoken about here. Multiculturalism. Now that is what I like to call the heyday of the era, but anyway, that's personal. Doesn't matter. Multiculturalism, that's where in the 70s and 80s, that's where the teaching of migrant languages exploded. So the heritage languages of the local community was very much celebrated and taught in schools, in the public school system. So it's a huge shift compared to the previous era. Now, then there was this sort of slight decline due to the economic rationalism era. So those of you who are around here in the 1990s, you might know the Asian decade or something that was called like that, where a lot of Asian languages were being taught in schools. So it was a shift away from migrant languages to languages that were considered to be economically useful. And all throughout that, and particularly nowadays, I think English literacy is a key thing over the teaching of migrant languages. So we've got 3 waves, these 3 ideologies or language policies, but what's underpinning all of this? It is the monolingual mindset. So this monolingual mindset, which many of you would know, is this sort of unofficial ideology where everyone should speak English. English monolingualism is the norm. If you speak other languages, you're somehow not Australian, or learning another language is somehow too hard, and why would you bother? So it's somewhat paradoxical. So even if this occurs within the evidence we've seen of migrant communities themselves, in our particular participants, there is that monolingual mindset which still occurs, so English monolingualism. And this is despite the fact, Australia's got like 300 languages that have been claimed to be spoken here. So,
Yeah, so now that we've established the scene, both the history of German speakers in Newcastle and the socio-cultural landscape that they migrated to, let's move forwards to what we wanted to do. Basically, what we wanted to know is how this affected the use of heritage German in Newcastle and the Hunter. So our research question was, how do broad societal ideology, language policy, and personal attitudes affect the plurilinguistic communicative practices of the local heritage German communities? So we've spoken to 50 people with German-speaking heritage from a variety of German-speaking areas in Europe. Participants provided some basic demographic details in the form of a questionnaire, which we then followed up with an interview in which we used a qualitative interview methodology with two foci. Firstly, a sort of socio-cultural historical focus, and secondly, a linguistics focus. And the interviews were, where possible, conducted in German. Participants expressed a variety of different reasons for either maintaining or shifting away from their German language use, or in some cases, gaining heritage language use despite a generational jump. Keeping in mind the historical and societal aspects we've just spoken about, let's explore some of the themes that seem to appear across multiple participants.
Okay, so we've got about 5 themes plus extras that we're going to be talking about. And the first theme that occurred through a lot of our participants' interviews was that of acculturation. So what we've got here, there's a lot of social pressures towards assimilation, towards fitting in. Marrying out, so marrying people of a different language background, English in most of the cases here, was a very big factor. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But in terms of Sarah here, we can see that she married an Australian, and even though Sarah's mother arrived in Australia as a monolingual German speaker, she raised her children to speak English only. So she's very much so raising an Australian family. And this is interesting because that also occurred in the participants' stories all the way throughout the multiculturalism era as well. A very interesting person here was Hoff. He started, as soon as he started speaking English, so monolingual German speaker until he went to school, and then he just simply refused to speak German. And so much so that in our interview, I spoke German to him, he responded in English. He understood everything, but he was very poor in his German production skills. So continuing this is where even where the parents really did strive for bilingualism here. We've got Furbert back. Furbert's talking about how once she discovered tomato sauce, she became very Australian, very anglicised. So again, we've got that idea of you refusing to speak German outside of the home, and that eventually led to language shift within the family. So we've got the focus here on child agency when it comes to the family language policy. Now, the next person here is Barbara. She chose not to pass German on to her children. The concept of acculturation was very strong. We're Aussies here, we're Australian, we adopted the persona. So even though she still regrets moving to Australia when she was 11 in the 50s, I know, she never forgave her father for that. She's never been back to Austria. She adopted this persona, and so she puts that idea. I love this quote. I know German, I know the language, why should I speak it? I think it's very much expresses what a lot of our people may have been thinking. Now, what does distinguish our research population from potentially from other migrant communities is anti-German sentiment. So particularly older participants in our study, they encountered a lot of anti-German sentiment from a very early age. So Flavia here was the child of German-speaking parents. And when she started primary school, when she started kindergarten, she was ostracized and made fun of because of her German heritage. So that then influenced her own language choice. Her use shifted to English, and that then infiltrated the home as well. So she basically says here, it became a lazy habit to speak German. So some of the participants really did feel some sense of shame of their cultural and linguistic heritage. So that they actually even mentioned the word shame. Da war irgendwie, a shame. So da war irgendwie means there was somewhat, or there was a bit of shame involved in being German. Didn't feel comfortable about their heritage there, and that's Claudia. So people were made fun of because of their heritage. We did get quite a lot of that. And there wasn't evidence in our conversations of people's attitude, or people shifting or noticing a shift in that. So we've got here, being German in Australia was very not cool for a very long time. Love the code switch. But basically there's a recognition, yeah, that time is over now. Claudia again says it's no longer quite so shameful to be German. And she arrived in 1981, so during that multiculturalism phase as well. So we see this shift, and there were a few of our participants talked about how the World Cup being held in Germany in 2006, there being a German Pope as well, changed that general attitude towards Germans that Australians had. Now, one of the key factors in language shift, as you would know, is exogamy, so marrying outside of the German-speaking community. So what happens there, you get this competition of different heritages, cultures and languages, and usually English is the one that wins out, actually pretty much always the case. So we can see here with Toby, always spoke German at home until he was married, and then brought the wife home to meet his parents, and then switched to English. We've also got some people with different multiple heritages here. So Margaret, again, so the Austrian Jewish father, she's married to a Samoan person, and then so their children and grandchildren have this very mixed cultural heritage. And what do they all have in common? They all have English. And of course, that's something that Agnes also emphasises here, the mixed heritage of her child. She's a pizza. So again, returning to that wave happening underneath everything, that sort of undercurrent, the monolingual mindset. So underpinning all of these factors that we've looked at so far is the monolingual mindset. It's persistent all the way throughout, even in eras where we wouldn't expect it to still occur. I mean, it still occurs today, so why wouldn't it have done so in the 1980s when Valerie's mother arrived? So the idea was, and it wasn't just the fact that we should speak English, it's some of the reasoning why people should only speak English. And here we've expressed some concern that Valerie's mother was, well, we've got to teach you English because otherwise you can't speak to the other kids at school. Some of the more serious side effects of that is the idea that it might be detrimental to be multilingual. So Sarah's mother expressed that as well at the time. Don't know another language because it's detrimental to your education. And again, that still exists in the participants who grew up in that era. And a really good example here is with Angela. Now, Angela, she had some learning difficulties at school. And she had some tests done. I don't know what these tests were, but these tests indicated, oh, it's because you're bilingual, you speak German. That's why you're having problems at school. So she's convinced now still that her bilingual side was causing a lot of the problems, despite the fact that she's been tested and she's been diagnosed with dyslexia. So it's still this idea that her multilingualism affects her ability to read and write today, or her ability to do schoolwork or whatever. However, it's not all gloom and doom. It's not all everyone's shifting to English. There were some attempts at language maintenance. There were some successful attempts at language maintenance in the families we've looked at. There were some opportunities as well, such as Flavia, who hung out, or whose family hung out with a little pocket of German speakers in Anna Bay. They had friends there. They spoke German. There was even a Lutheran church there for a while. And so they used to go to the Germania Club a lot. They had Austrian friends. So it maintained, it was continued in the family, at least until the second generation, a little bit further into the second generation. And what we have here, this other quote is with Ingrid, or from Ingrid. And she says the German language lives here in Australia with us, with her and her husband. So it's still very much alive. We can still talk about German speak as being a language of the community, at least within that little family themselves. But interestingly, and this is really supported by Marcel, fair enough, he's a Swiss German speaker, so not really German, depending who you talk to. But then he made a conscious decision to use Swiss German at home, but only with his wife, only after the children grew up and left home. So the children refused to speak Swiss German, but he's like, no, we're going to speak Swiss German, my wife and I. So we find that it's maintained within the first generation, and that's the same with Ingrid and her husband. However, Rita, and also a Swiss German speaker, she just said, no, we're speaking German. We're speaking Swiss German at home. It's easier. And it did help her at the beginning when she moved here with the homesickness. But even today, the children have moved out of home. They still speak Swiss German with the children. And they do a little bit of code mixing when an English word they can't quite think of an English word, and they come up with this term Swinglish. So Swiss, German and English. Now, you would think that teaching of the German language throughout schools was a thing. Well, it was, but it was a bit haphazard, and it has always been a little bit haphazard. You might say there's been a decline in the teaching of German, but it's also always enjoyed this sort of language, this high status of high culture, philosophy and history and so on. So there is a reason for German to be still maintained throughout. Sacha mentioned before there was a Saturday school that started in the 1960s that went to the 1990s. That, interestingly, wasn't held on a Saturday. And the idea was to reinforce language acquisition, so reinforce the German language at home of these children of migrants. Now, because of state policy, because of official language policy of the New South Wales state, influenced by the then national policy on languages, we see the introduction of community language classes around the place. And Warners Bay, that's where quite a few German speakers were. So this is where the community language German was taught in school from 1983 until the early 1990s. So interestingly enough, I am a product of this. This is my German teacher, Barbara Poor, and I went to that school, and that started my whole language learning journey. So yeah, I wouldn't be here if it was not for that person right there. But interestingly, Barbara, I mentioned a little bit earlier, her son had to independently go and learn German in school because Barbara, even though her career started off teaching German, she didn't speak it in the home, didn't teach her own children German. So it was more of a sort of utility. You can get a job, okay, I'll do this for a job. But still, then, even though we've got this multiculturalism phase and so on, there was quite a big backlash in the community at the time. You know, that the idea of parents not wanting their children to learn another language because it might prevent them from becoming literate in English. So as a result of that, Barbara taught or focused more on the German culture as opposed to the German language. So they're the themes that occurred sort of more prominently throughout our interviews. There are a few little bits and pieces as well worth mentioning. A couple of people talked about the limited utility of knowing German. We've got this great quote from Manfred. German's not much use to you. He didn't pass on German to his children, and yet he's got this rediscovered interest in German now in his older age. Then Marcel again, talking about Swiss German's rather useless. I want my children to learn Spanish. At least that's useful. They speak it in more different countries. So we've got this lack of transmission within the family because of utility reasons. And a change in personal attitude. I mean, a lot of this depends on the individual as well. And we find that within many of the families where we've spoken to one of multiple siblings. It's usually one who is interested in maintaining the language. And we see here with Claudia, who has a shift in her own personal attitude over time. So while we can't really talk about language maintenance as such, because that generally refers to a whole community, we can speak of language maintenance or language revitalization to a point within the individual here. So when she first arrived, she didn't want to hang out with German speakers, didn't want to have anything to do with them. But now her attitude's changed and she's like, oh, you speak German, do you? Blah, blah, blah. And note, we've got the original quote here in German. She says everything in German until she starts speaking to the German speaker. So other individual factors that are more individual or related to the family. We've got Anna here. Now, Anna, her own personal circumstances were such that she doesn't have the vocabulary for affection, for love and relationships in German. All of that is in English. So that meant that she raised her children, even though she's a fluent German speaker still, she raised her children in English. And Claudia, again, I think she wins the prize for the most quotes actually in this presentation. Claudia, born and raised in Germany, but she was the youngest and she lacked the vocabulary for child-directed speech. She didn't know how to speak to little kids in German. She learned how to do that here in Australia, and therefore it was in English. Now this last quote, and I promise it is the last quote, is from Lily. Now this emphasizes this isolation that we briefly mentioned earlier. Little pockets maybe, or individuals spread throughout the community who use the German language. Now Lily, the only person she knows who uses German is her mother. And she's afraid that when her mother dies, well, the language will as well, because she'll have nobody to use German with. And just to emphasize that isolation, that is a feature of German speakers, as well as Dutch as well, and one or two others. But basically, if we look at the census data again of where German speakers are located, we can see what essentially is the general population spread of Newcastle and the Hunter Valley. So there's no centre, there's no pocket. There's just evenly spread throughout the whole population of people in the area. So yeah, a lot of isolation. One of the questions we ask in the interviews is, do you know anyone who speaks German? And they're like, no, just my family, my parents, grandparents, whatever, but no one in the neighbourhood. One little extra thing I just wanted to put in there again for Barbara is that we're focusing on the use of German, but of course there are many dialects of German. And a lot of people, even though pretty much everyone in our conversation spoke standard German to us, some had slight Swabian dialects. And here we have Barbara, who created word lists, a good old vocabulary list with a translation into English. And you might not be able to see it very clearly, but she's written out a list of Swabian sayings. So it's very much not German, but Swabian. And we have a number of participants who also, they're not just bilingual, but plurilingual, multilingual. So here Croatian slips in as well, and she's not necessarily sure whether it's Swabian or Croatian. Some of these words she's written down. So, what does this all mean in terms of our project? How do we conclude? How do we sum up? Well, what we can see is there's a real big, it's really complicated. We talked about the waves having their own individual characteristics, the different ideologies at different times, this monolingual mindset. What we find is we've got the macro level meso level and micro level, particularly the micro or individual factors that have prevented language transmission or language maintenance. So we had 50 participants, we had almost 50 different reasons why the language wasn't passed on in the family. And what we also find is that even though society has shifted, the effects of it were much longer lasting. There was a lag. So even though it was like everyone is thinking, hooray, multiculturalism, multilingualism, it didn't necessarily penetrate into individual families at all, or until very much later. There are little pockets of use, little families as we little spread out bits and pieces of speakers around the place, but language shift is very much the key theme here. And it's mostly by the third generation, which is exactly what Fishman talks about in his 3-generation model of language shift there. So what happens, we have found each time a new wave comes in, they bring in new speakers, adding to the community of German speakers. But sometimes maintenance skips a generation. We spoke to plenty of people who didn't acquire it in the home and have actively sought German to learn German outside the home in formal contexts. We've had some 3rd-generation speakers who've also done that, who are very much interested in their heritage language. So, in order for German to be maintained as a language spoken within this particular community, and we can say nationwide as well, I guess, we really do have to rely on newcomers to keep adding to the pool of German speakers. So, just to make sure that we haven't made this all up, here are some of our references that we've used, and we would like to say Dankeschön, thank you very much for listening.
Okay, so I'll let you guys field questions, but let's be mindful of the fact that there might be some questions on Zoom, and Hedda had a question.
Yes.
So, Hedda.
Yes. Hey. Sorry. That's so amazing, so fascinating. I absolutely loved this. Danke. That's as much as I remember from our German lessons. Look, to me, this, your study feels very personal to me, although for me it is a different language, but the whole idea about language acquisition and maintenance, particularly within the family, is something that I live. And one of my experiences have been with my 2 children being very different in their openness to and up to Norwegian as a second language, but also kind of so the oldest being truly bilingual, and the youngest just not seeming to be capable of keeping 2 languages in his head. And subsequently, we've ended up becoming an English-speaking family instead of a Norwegian-speaking family. Now, what I've experienced being really important for us has been the return visits back home. And I was wondering if your data spoke much about the idea of return visits, but also the engagement with German literature, with kind of the written language within the family specifically. And if you did talk about that, I do apologize, I came in a little bit late.
No, we didn't mention it here, but we certainly had plenty of people who did speak exactly about that. So Sacha, would you like to?
Yeah, so I mean, first thing I think we need to note is that going back to places of origin was a common theme regardless of language skills, right? So people often went back as sort of either nostalgia tourism or family history tourism. But we certainly found a lot of people who travelled back for the very purpose of reinforcing language, and often quite successfully. sometimes as adults, sometimes as children, sometimes, I mean, we had one family, first wave family, where the mother had basically not learned German at home, but took herself and her daughter to Germany to learn German in order for them both to claim language. So that was hugely important. Interestingly, and we've got an article, a chapter on this that's finally reached the forthcoming stage and might even be published this millennium, looking at where people go to and and overwhelmingly where they go to is Germany itself, rather than to the various other places they might have come from. Some to Austria and Switzerland, but overwhelmingly it's to Germany, regardless of where the family originally came from. So that's very important. Engagement in literature, I think, was very individual, and one of the things I think we've noticed visiting people sometimes in their houses in order to interview them is there's an awful lot of German language books from the time when they migrated, and very few after that date. So I can't swear they're not all reading the books on Kindle, but it seems to be the literature they bring with is the literature they remained attached to.
So what we have, and I did a presentation at a conference back in September as well, where we looked at the language output of our second generation participants, and there was a very strong correlation between those participants who had gone over and spent time as adults in Austria and Germany, as opposed to those who had grown up as a heritage language in the home. So it's really those had gone. We had two participants whose mother came to Australia from Austria in the 80s, spoke only English in the home, apart from the odd word here and there for dishcloth and such. Fetzen, if you're interested. And it was one of them, again, out of 5 children, there was one who was really, really interested in the heritage and the language, and spent a lot of time with the extended family in Austria, really working hard to acquire his language. He went to university and studied the language there, did language courses and so on. So we did find that with a couple of participants going back as adults, but they also spent time as children. So that same person, Frank his name is, his older sister had spent extended stays with that same family as a child, and she claimed to come back speaking only German, but only for a very short period. We're talking about a child under 5. And she then has not maintained it personally.
Just on that note, I think one thing that is interesting I find with the kids is when they deal with kids, they will speak Norwegian, even though it's broken and bad. But when they deal with when they deal with adults, because Norwegians speak good English, they will just switch over to English for them. So I don't know if that's anything you have noticed in your data, that as Germans become more fluent in English as well, I mean, that's certainly what's happened back home in Norway, that has made it harder for my bilingual children to actually practice Norwegian, because it's easy that they want to practice English, and also it just seems easier to go for the English.
Yeah, it's often the case that they want to go over there and use their German, but everyone speaks English better than they speak German. So it's just, well, why struggle? Yeah, very interesting. It's always the second or the third child in any family there's a decline in heritage language use as the children get younger and younger. I mean, as they go down in age. It's very, very common.
So I have a question about attrition that I think many of the long-term immigrants in this room can have. We struggle, right, as we become more fluent in English, and then that's our daily language. And I was wondering if you had observed the attrition. I have observed attrition in old immigrants from Japan in Sydney area, and they are pronounced in a different field or aspects or level of linguistic skills. So did you catch that trace of attrition in their phonology, syntax, lexical choices? Register. If they decided to abandon, or if they decided not to speak their language to their children, right? They had this period where they didn't speak the language and then they became more fluent in English. And although they must be speaking English with a strong German accent, their German is also affected. And I was wondering which side of German seemed to be more affected.
Well, we haven't analysed the data yet for actual evidence of language attrition as such, but what did stand out was a lot more code switching. So the participants we spoke German with, the generation who migrated, those who came as very young children and so on, I think we can consider that to be a separate group altogether, but those who migrated as adults, I don't recall anything standing out in terms of attrition on a phonological level or things, but basically a few lexical choices and some code switching was there. But it's typical in the sense, because I was listening out for use of anglicisms, because that's also my thing. But some people had very strict ideas about not speaking gobbledygook. Very strict ideas. They called it Kauderwelsch, which is like gobbledygook. And that's no, German is German. We have to keep it German. Not mix it with anything else. So I found the maintenance in terms of attrition I don't know, maybe because I'm not a native speaker, I didn't really quite pick up on many things. I haven't done a syntactic analysis thoroughly yet. But on the surface, no, I was trying to get some evidence, but it's like, I can't really find any.
I think though there were a couple of shifts that we have observed, and one is a movement away from the use of the formal form to the informal,
Yes.
Which actually is not that uncommon in Germany itself these days, but for the time when those people migrated, it was highly unusual, and you tend to find that amongst German speakers in Australia. They just will not use the formal form, which I'm totally in favour of, but no problems from me. The other thing is that some people we spoke to one older Swiss couple who were very deliberately using English words, this was the Swinglish quote, where the German word was longer, right? So they didn't want to say, they said fridge instead of Kühlschrank, because who has time to say Kühlschrank when you can just say fridge, for example. So there's little examples like that would crop up, but as Jamie says, and Jamie's the linguist, so he'll be doing the analysis, we haven't looked at that in detail yet.
I wanted to ask if any of your participants that had been back to Germany or to places where the language was spoken more natively, they noticed that they were speaking an older version of the language. I have some friends from Heritage Greek, and she goes over to Greece and everyone tells her she talks like an old grandmother. I was wondering if there was any notice of that happening.
Yeah, that was one of the questions essentially. Did you notice any changes when you went back and so on? We did have just only a couple actually mentioned speaking differently.
Hatoss just asked the same question.
Yes, yeah. So there was some. Other people just said, nope, nothing's different, but I think it really would depend on who they're talking to, because if you're talking to your sibling, they're going to have the language of the same generation, so you're not going to really notice it. So, do you recall anything specific about that?
I don't recall anyone saying anything specific about that. But I can't recall.
That's a pretty well-known phenomenon, though. So you get, although there is attrition, on the flip side, you get maintenance in migrant language communities, which is why, Icelandic is still basically Norse of 1,000 years ago, and why you get all these archaic features in Quebec French and so on. And I've got exactly the same experience with Greek people who are Greek Australians who speak Greek as it was in the 1950s when their family, immigrated. It's quite a well-known.
And certainly I see that in German myself in in preparation for the interviewing process, because my German has mainly become read German rather than spoken German. I went on to Duolingo. And I was amazed at the terms for which, my language teachers would have thwacked me over the head with a textbook for using English language loanwords in these contexts where the English language loanword now seems to be the standard in German. I have this vague memory, one of the interviewers talked about the influence of English on German when they went back or something like that, but I can't remember who it was.
Notice the number of anglicisms you used.
But I can't remember who it was.
I think it may have
Probably
been.
not the most adequate answer to your question, but it's what the data is supporting at the minute.
When you say anglicisms, could you give us an example? Yeah, off the cuff. Sorry.
Also mein typisches Beispiel ist, ich habe gestern ein Meeting gehabt. Ein Meeting.
Meeting.
Or photo apparat for camera. It's now just a camera, right?
Yeah, maybe you could argue that it's not really an anglicism.
So can I just cut in? We've got a minute. Now we can sit and continue to chat a little bit. I think some people will have to go, but I just want to point out that next week, same time, same channel, Julia Cook will be presenting a seminar. Julia Cook from Sociology and Anthropology, giving us a talk, and I'll sort of send the flyer around about that soon.
Thank you. Thank you, people online.
Okay, thanks very much.